No matter what the subject is in the world, most likely politics can be introduced into it. From the healthcare we are provided, to the firearms we are allowed to bear, to the environment that life has lived in before humanity even existed. One might ask, how are humans allowed to govern and control the environment if it has existed long before humans have? My name is Romeo Aranzaso, and I will introduce you into the controversy that lays between the EPA, environmental activists, and conservatives that are trying to reshape the EPA. Addressing the previous question from before, we must first ask, what is the environment? The environment is the vicinity of the landmass that holds life within it, as well as the organisms themselves. The environment can also range from simple organisms like bacteria to complex organisms like ourselves. The environment is always changing naturally, but still can be influenced from unnatural occurrences, such as human interference. With humans on the majority of the landmass of Earth, humans are bound to change the environment from infrastructure to factory gas emissions to the production of plastic. We will break down how these interferences can hurt the environment in three different ways: air pollution, water pollution, and light pollution. Air pollution may be the most dangerous of them all, inflicting damage to all living things within the environment. Factories, fracking, and other energy extraction methods all pollute the air. Carbon dioxide is one of the most well-known greenhouse gases that is causing air pollution, and greenhouse gases essentially increase the surface temperature of Earth, which also dramatically increases the speed of climate change. Although climate change is always naturally occurring, it still can be influenced too, just like the environment. Water pollution is also one of the most dangerous influences humans have on the environment, from fracking, as we mentioned, sewage runoffs, to algae blooms. Sewage runoffs contaminate water sources, which will eventually lead to algae blooms. Although algae blooms consist of living things, algae themselves, they aren't necessarily beneficial for the environment, and they kind of act like a weed, a garden weed. They interfere with other living competitors around it, and don't necessarily do any good for the environment. Light pollution is a different way of hurting the environment that a lot of people may look over. Light pollution can conflict with nocturnal animal schedules to function, which can give a false sense of daylight, forcing nocturnal animals to shelter throughout the whole day. Light pollution can also interfere with humans and different animals by blinding them or just putting strain on their eyes. Now that we've seen the potential of human destruction, who was there to stop humans from destroying the environment? It's another group of humans called the EPA. Who is the EPA? The EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency exclusive to the United States. The EPA was founded in 1970 with 15 administrators reigning ever since, all appointed by the current president at the time, which would give the president a little more control on how he wants to run the country. The current administrator for the EPA, appointed by our current president, Donald Trump, is Andrew Wheeler. He is a Republican, but most importantly to take note, he is a former coal lobbyist. You can now see where conflicts may reside between the environment and the EPA. It is important to know that although the EPA is not a cabinet department, the EPA still holds high in power, with the administrator given a cabinet rank. Nevertheless, the EPA was founded to ensure the protection of our environment, with many laws and acts established to do so. Some examples would be the Clean Water Act, which was later strengthened under Obama's administration, as well as the Clean Air Act, both being one of the most important regulations for our environment. Other accomplishments to note are the removal of lead in gasoline, which will drastically decrease emissions from cars that used the gasoline for fuel. The ban of the pesticide of DDT, which would play an effective insecticide, but was soon discovered to be able to transfer from organism to organism, ultimately leading to human consumption. The Endangered Species Act primarily allowed for the prohibition of importing or selling endangered animals, but also put extra protection on top of that. Last but not least, there's the Energy Policy Act, which would try to stray away from greenhouse gases in exchange for renewable energy sources. But of course, good things can't be perfect, so there are bound to be conflicts and controversy. Due to the economic role the EPA plays in business through environmental regulations and laws that can obstruct corporations and farmers, the EPA is thus considered controversial and hated by most conservatives. Some people, commonly wealthy conservatives, often despise the EPA and their regulations in the environment because it often conflicts with their jobs or their plans for the future. The EPA can affect groups of farmers, real estate developers, or landowners. The EPA's regulations could prohibit these groups from building or industrializing certain parts of the environment, losing potential economic business. This may seem selfish, but rolling back EPA regulations would allow for the economy to thrive through increased agriculture, energy, or industrialization. Farmers take nearly half of the US's landmass, providing a majority of the country's produce, so they're saying the environment is very crucial. And if there was one person these groups of people would look up to for help, it would be Donald Trump. The Trump administration of the EPA has been a wild ride over the past 4 years. Rather than putting forth more regulations to protect the environment, he spent most of his time deregulating past regulations that were already established before his presidency. Because the administrator of the EPA is appointed by the president, sometimes the intentions of the actions taken may lean toward the president's liking rather than the common people, or even the Congress or members of the agency itself. Many sources claim that the Trump administration has reversed over 100 environmental rules, virtually reversing the EPA's mission from the start. Over his presidency, Trump's EPA has mostly gotten what they want, with economic gains most likely being their primary intention. Here are the highlights of his changes broken down. The Clean Water Act was established in 1972, only 2 years after the EPA was founded. The Clean Water Act regulated what and how much goes into the water, which would also simultaneously regulate the quality of the water. This is not the first federal law that has been placed on water, with the Water Rule Act being based on the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, which was later strengthened and specified to make the acts we have today. With these acts, problems came along the way. These regulations will increase the amount of environmental reviews, which would slow the process of many projects around the country. Not only this, but there will be unnecessary, expensive permits to perform maintenance on the environment, which will lose money and time. Some of these streams and wetlands that now have regulations on them are important for drinking and wildlife, which would make it harder to get. Written by conservative American thinker Rick Moran, the EPA runs roughshod over property rights and represents a massive overreach of federal authority, unprecedented even for the president. Conservatives feel as if their property and rights are being taken away from them, which is the polar opposite of what the American dream and American freedom is to them. The Clean Air Act was established in 1970, the same year the EPA was founded. The Clean Air Act would regulate air emissions from stationary and mobile sources, such as cars or factories. There would also be a standard set called the National Ambient Air Quality Standard, which would further regulate hazard air pollutants. The goal of the act was for the standards to be met in every state. An example to help regulate these standards, factories and chemical plants must install pollution control equipment for them to meet emission limits. This causes many problems for coal and oil industries to thrive, which would devastate their economy. With renewable energy resources not being sufficient enough to cover all of the U.S. yet, coal and oil industries still have potential in thriving. They are a huge backbone of this country, and for them to be on your side in politics can be very crucial. This is when we see politicians' interests turn to power rather than the common people. Many Republicans believe that climate change isn't a priority, with some even believing climate change isn't real. Because of this, coal and oil industries can gain power without batting any Republican's eye. The other half of the country disagrees with this and claims climate change is real and should be a priority. So how did Republicans gain enough power to change the EPA? As previously mentioned, Andrew Wheeler is a former coal lobbyist. Lobbyists are experienced persuaders who specify a certain subject, such as gun control or environmental law, and in an organized attempt, try to influence legislators. Because direct bribing with money is illegal, there has to be a system of how this works, the Iron Triangle. In its simplest form, the triangle could go any way in the cycle of the legislative committee, interest groups, and the bureaucratic agencies. This triangle allows for a systematic strategy to persuade and pass laws in their favor, despite if it is in the common people's interest. Members within the triangle could also fluctuate between the three different branches, as proven by Andrew Wheeler. It seems now that once Republicans realize that this could come with a devastating loss, their heads quickly turn to the other side. With the EPA founded by Richard Nixon, a Republican, and many Republicans advocating for the EPA ever since, it's kind of ironic that they now see that they are losing their own money in return to helping the environment. The roles have switched from Republicans having the advantage for advocating for a better environment to the Democrats getting the upper hand. The effectiveness of the Iron Triangle allows for Trump's administration to reverse the regulations established from the EPA due to the full control he had of Congress. Although Republicans won the vote, the majority of Americans prefer for a better environment. This is where controversy started laying around the EPA, with Americans finally realizing the importance of the environment. And we have also learned that the EPA regulations could simply fluctuate from president to president, as we've seen from the Obama's era to Trump's era. One of the only ways to penetrate the Iron Triangle and to take control of the environment is to take control of Congress, which will allow for different interest groups to step forward depending on the politician. The Iron Triangle, consisting of Congress, bureaucracies, and interest groups, may make a common American feel powerless in this country, but all of these regulations and laws started from one thing: your vote. I'm Romeo Aranzaso. Thank you for listening.